Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we take your stack of sources, articles, research, and our own notes and extract the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight.
Hello.
Today, we're plunging into a topic that's both profoundly important and often debated: how European powers systematically underdeveloped Africa. We're going beyond just the what to really examine the mechanisms and functions of this system.
That's right. Our mission today is to unpack precisely how a colonial apparatus was built that fundamentally shaped the continent's trajectory, leading to enduring challenges that resonate even today.
Yeah, challenges we still grapple with.
We're drawing from rich academic papers and historical accounts to give you, a nuanced understanding of the historical context, the coercive strategies employed, and those long-term legacies that continue to impact societies.
Right, so you'll gain a deeper appreciation for the intricate ways these systems were designed to extract rather than develop.
Exactly. Extraction is the key word there.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're starting at the very root of the matter. The driving forces that led to what history calls the scramble for Africa. It wasn't just a random burst of exploration or opportunity, was it? Our sources make it abundantly clear that deep escalating demands within Europe itself directly fueled this aggressive expansion.
Absolutely. The undeniable primary catalyst was the Industrial Revolution, a period of unprecedented socioeconomic transformation and technological advancement across Europe. I mean, imagine factories in Britain, France, Germany, churning out textiles, machinery, consumer goods at an almost unbelievable rate.
Just an explosion of production.
Right, an explosion. And this rapid industrialization created a fundamental imbalance, a massive increase in production that quite simply outpaced what European agriculture could supply and what existing domestic markets could possibly absorb. The internal dynamics of European capitalism created an external imperative.
So a booming industrial sector at home meant an insatiable appetite for raw materials far beyond what Europe's own borders could provide. It sounds like a resource crunch on a grand scale.
Precisely. The demand for raw materials became truly astronomical. European industries needed vast quantities of minerals like gold, copper, diamonds, tin, iron, zinc, you name it.
Things needed for the new machines, new technologies.
Exactly. Think about the burgeoning electrical industry, the need for copper wiring, the steel mills demanding iron and other alloys, the jewelry and luxury goods markets requiring gold and diamonds. But it wasn't just minerals. On the agricultural side, they needed wool for textiles, sisal for ropes and twine, palm oil for lubricants and soaps, cotton for their vast textile mills, cocoa for the new chocolate industry, rubber for tires and new industrial applications, and groundnuts for oils and other products.
A huge shopping list.
A huge list. And the sources explicitly state it was becoming increasingly hard for European agriculture to satisfy this immense and diverse demand, forcing countries like Britain to cast their gaze far abroad. This wasn't just about finding some resources. It was about securing a continuous, massive supply chain to feed their rapidly growing industrial beast.
And it wasn't solely about raw materials for factories, was it? The Industrial Revolution also fundamentally reshaped European populations, pulling people from rural areas into burgeoning industrial cities. Those cities needed to be fed, leading to another pressure point.
Correct. Industrialization led to a significant decline in domestic agricultural production within Europe itself. As labor shifted from farms to factories, rural areas became, less productive agriculturally.
Fewer farmers.
Fewer farmers, more mouths to feed in the cities. This made it increasingly difficult for the European countryside to produce enough food for the rapidly expanding urban populations. So, Africa became a potential source not just for industrial inputs, but also for external food supplies and things like spices, too.
So it's resources, markets, and food.
It was comprehensive. The quest was comprehensive. Resources for industry, markets for surplus goods, and food for growing populations. It highlights how intrinsically linked Europe's internal development was to its external expansionist policies.
So Europe was producing more manufactured goods than its own people could consume, simultaneously needing more raw materials and food than it could domestically produce. That sounds like a system ripe for looking elsewhere. And then there's the financial dimension. All this industrial growth, especially with low wages, must have generated immense profits that needed new outlets.
Indeed. This is where the concept of surplus capital becomes critical. Due to relatively low wages and high efficiency in European factories, industrialists accumulated profits at a faster rate than they could effectively reinvest them domestically. This led to what our sources call an underutilization of capital within Europe.
Too much cash, not enough places to put it at home.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
There was too much money chasing too few truly profitable domestic investment opportunities. This created a powerful impetus to find new avenues for investment abroad, places where capital could be put to work, building mines, plantations, railways, trading infrastructure, generating even greater returns. Our sources are clear on this. It was during this process of investment of the surplus capital that imperialism emerged. It wasn't merely about selling goods, it was about establishing systems for capital to continually reproduce and expand on a global scale. The function of colonialism in this sense was to provide new frontiers for European capital.
And as Chinvarezu noted back in 1978, when Europe pioneered industrial capitalism, her demands upon the resources of the world increased tremendously. He talks about spices and manpower for the Americas, but then makes a key point. Europe set out to seize for her factories the mineral and agricultural resources of all the world.
That's a powerful quote.
And he goes on, her need to take African manpower to the Americas declined. She needed instead to put African labor to work in Africa, digging up for her the riches of African mines. That paints a very stark picture of a systemic evolution in how Africa was viewed and utilized. The focus shifted from exporting people to exploiting labor in situ.
It truly does. This quote perfectly encapsulates how the internal dynamics of European capitalism directly translated into external pressures on the African continent, not just for resources, but for organized, coerced labor within Africa itself.
A huge shift.
It was a fundamental functional change from the earlier transatlantic slave trade. The demand shifted from raw manpower to extract wealth elsewhere, to structured, often forced, labor systems within Africa designed to extract resources directly for European factories and markets. This transition, from the slave trade to legitimate trade and then to direct colonial control marks a significant, deliberate shift in how Europe intended to use Africa, integrating it into its industrial supply chain as a source of both raw materials and cheap labor.
So once the motivations were clear: raw materials, new markets, food, and profitable investment opportunities for surplus capital, the next step was implementing control. And this wasn't some gentle negotiation, was it? This was a systematic subjugation of African sovereignty, a comprehensive strategy.
No, it was far from gentle. Our sources are explicit. The colonization of Africa was not a very easy one because colonialists faced significant organized resistance from chiefs, existing African states, and even African middlemen, particularly along the coast, before they could even penetrate the interior.
So there was pushback.
Oh, absolutely. This was not a passive continent waiting to be taken. They encountered established societies with their own political and economic structures.
And once they did penetrate, it wasn't merely a military conquest to plant a flag. It was a multifaceted assault designed to dismantle and reorder every aspect of African life.
Precisely. Various African states and territories were conquered politically, economically, culturally, socially, and enslaved. This wasn't merely about establishing military dominance. It was a comprehensive reordering of society, a systematic stripping away of self-determination.
It sounds all-encompassing.
Chinwezu, in that same work, describes this assault quite vividly, stating, "For nearly 6 centuries now, Western Europe and its diaspora have been disturbing the peace of the world. White hordes have sailed forth from Western European homelands to explore, assault, loot, occupy, rule, and exploit the rest of the world."
That quote really underscores the long historical pattern, the sheer scale of it.
It does. And the inherently aggressive, extractive nature. The core insight here is that colonization was a total subjugation, not just a military one.
That's a powerful statement. And part of this comprehensive assault was systematic interference in internal affairs, even before full-blown conquest. It sounds like they started by subtly undermining existing power structures before ramping up to direct control.
Yes, that's an astute observation. Responding to pressure from their own traders and economic interests, European powers began systematically to interfere with the sovereignty of African states and to intrude upon their internal affairs. This wasn't always about direct military action initially. It was about undermining existing power structures from within, weakening them for future takeover.
like softening them up.
You could say that. They would actively help one faction depose a ruler, then install another more favorable to their interests, and then bestow honors or recognition on those who serve their agenda. This deliberate policy destabilized and fractured African polities, making them easier targets for subsequent, more overt control. It was a calculated strategy of internal subversion.
A classic divide-and-conquer strategy, then, often backed up by their own brand of gunboat diplomacy. Can you give us a concrete example of how this military display exposed African weakness and paved the way for deeper control?
One of the clearest examples comes from the West African coast. A British squadron, sent in 1810, began patrolling the waters. Its official mission was twofold: enforce the 1807 slave trade ban and protect British legitimate traders.
Okay, sounds reasonable on the surface.
But the profound impact was how this constant military presence exposed the military and political weakness of the African states. For centuries, African rulers had maintained control over trade within their domains, often negotiating from a position of strength. Under the imposing shadow of British naval guns, their ability and inherent right to determine the rules of trade within their own territories withered.
So the threat was always there.
The threat was implicit but powerful. This directly undermined their power and sovereignty, systematically displacing African traders and establishing European dominance over the terms of trade. It was a clear, functional assertion of power, making it abundantly clear who set the rules and controlled the maritime arteries of commerce. The implicit threat of force reshaped economic relations.
So once they had a foot in the door, whether through outright conquest or by undermining existing power, the full-scale economic coercion truly began. And this was centered around the most fundamental assets for any society: land and labor. It sounds like a highly deliberate system designed to extract maximum value from the African continent.
It was absolutely a meticulously engineered system. The foundational step was widespread land confiscation and dispossession. You have to understand that for most African societies, land was not merely property. It was the bedrock of their existence, their cultural identity, their entire livelihood system.
Everything came from the land.
Everything. People lived on and derived everything they needed: food, shelter, resources, directly from the land. So systematically taking that land away immediately forced them to seek alternative means of survival. This wasn't just about acquiring resources. It was a primary mechanism to forcibly create a dependent labor force, stripping people of their economic autonomy.
And if they weren't willing to work for the colonialists, or if their land hadn't been fully taken, there are other means to compel them. This sounds like an elaborate, multi-pronged system to force African labor into European enterprises.
Indeed. The direct consequence of land confiscation was dispossession, which, for many, literally left them with no other means of survival or livelihood than to work for the colonialists unwillingly. They had to work just to subsist and, crucially, to support their families.
Basic survival needs driving them into the system.
Exactly. But beyond this fundamental economic pressure, legal coercion was widely used. A particularly effective and infamous example is the burdensome hut tax imposed in many colonies, like Sierra Leone, which was harshly enforced.
The hut tax, I've read about that.
Imagine, if you lived in a hut, you owed a tax, payable only in the new European currency. To earn the money for this tax, because traditional economies didn't operate on European currency, Africans had to sell their labor to white men.
Wow. So the tax wasn't just revenue generation. It was a brilliantly simple yet brutal labor recruitment tool.
Precisely that. It was designed to force people into the wage economy.
So even if you managed to hold on to some traditional land, the imposition of European currency and the hut tax would still force you into the colonial labor system. What if even that didn't yield enough labor for their mines and plantations?
Then they resorted to even more overt forms of compulsion: compulsory labor ordinances. These were specific laws making it obligatory on persons of the laboring classes to give labor for public purposes, though public purposes almost always meant projects that benefited the colonial administration or European enterprises.
Like building railways for them.
Exactly. Or carrying supplies for military expeditions. For instance, in 1895, the Gold Coast compelled chiefs to furnish vast numbers of carriers for a military expedition against Ashanti. It was a legal framework for forced labor. And if all else failed, if taxation or ordinances didn't yield enough labor, or if the demands were particularly high, native police were sent out to collect the labor.
Literally rounding people up.
Literally rounding them up, as notoriously happened in South Africa, to fill the ranks of the mine workforce. This wasn't about voluntary employment incentives. It was a systematic, layered approach to forcing labor, a critical function of the colonial economic machine.
And this extensive labor coercion wasn't just about bodies in the mines or fields. It went hand in hand with a grand plan to dismantle the existing social fabric, particularly the communal, tribal system. Why was that so important to the colonial agenda? What was the deeper functional purpose of breaking down these social structures?
Because the tribal system provided solidarity and some political and economic strength to native life. It offered a collective safety net, a traditional system of land tenure, mechanisms for community self-governance. The colonialists sought to deliberately break this down, to isolate the kafir on an individual footing as an economic bargainer.
Make them individuals easier to control.
That was the goal, yes. Remove the traditional collective support, making individuals more vulnerable and more easily coerced. By breaking down communal bonds and traditional land rights, the system could more effectively force individuals from their localities by taxation, by direct conscription, or by economic duress into mines or plantations. This effectively appropriated the surplus labor of Africa for their own profit and development.
And the sources say this led to dehumanization.
Yes, this process, as our sources highlight, directly led to the dehumanization and, in many cases, literal incarceration of the African labor force within a system that stripped them of their agency and communal identity. It was a deliberate strategy to weaken collective resistance and facilitate individualized exploitation, making it easier to control and extract.
It's clear that taxation wasn't just about revenue generation then. It was a profoundly powerful tool for labor mobilization and social control.
Absolutely. The system was designed to make tax evasion very difficult through effective systems of collection and accountability and up-to-date records of taxpayers. This intimidatory approach, often backed by punitive measures for non-payment, compelled almost all adult African males to seek for employment in the colonial services in order to earn adequate money to pay their tax.
No escape, really.
Very little escape. This ensured a readily available African labor force for colonial use, a crucial and continuous mechanism for their economic objectives. The tax system was not for public services for Africans. Its primary function was to push Africans into wage labor for European enterprises.
So land, labor, taxation, all intertwined to create a pervasive system of forced exploitation. But they also needed to control the flow of money itself. The deliberate monetization of the African economy sounds like another crucial piece of this puzzle for maintaining control.
It was truly an essential mechanism for fully integrating African economies into the European-dominated world market and international trade. Prior to colonization, many African economies operated on, sophisticated barter systems or with various forms of localized currency like cowrie shells, iron rods, or gold dust that often lacked universal acceptability or easy divisibility for the kind of large-scale trade Europe envisioned.
Right, not convenient for them.
Not convenient for their system. Colonial powers systematically introduced their own currencies, primarily the British pound, French franc, etc., as the only official acceptable medium of exchange. This gave them immense power, not just over trade, but over the very economic fabric of African societies, forcing a shift from indigenous systems to one controlled from London or Paris.
And that control over the introduced currency allowed them to manipulate prices, creating a perpetually unequal exchange that favored them. Right? It was a rigged game from the start.
Yes, this was a key functional mechanism of systematic underdevelopment. Colonialists used their control over the introduced currency to deliberately manipulate prices. Raw materials and agricultural products produced by Africans, cocoa, cotton, groundnuts, palm oil, minerals, were made too cheap through administered pricing systems and the elimination of African middlemen who might negotiate better prices.
Driving down the value of African labor and resources.
Exactly. Conversely, manufactured goods imported from Europe, textiles, tools, processed foods, were made too dear or high. This meant an African would spend all he had toiled for a year or more to purchase a little of the foreign goods.
So they were trapped in a cycle.
A cycle of impoverishment, basically. Africans kept on becoming poorer while colonialist profits kept increasing. This financial manipulation ensured a continuous supply of cheap labor, as Africans had to keep on working hard just to access foreign goods they desired, or simply to survive and pay their taxes. It was a systemic trap, ensuring wealth flowed out not within Africa.
And to really maximize that labor force, they employed a strategy of deliberately low wages, ensuring that entire families had to work for colonial enterprises. This sounds like a cold, calculated, economic decision.
Precisely. The payment of low wages to Africans employed in the colonial service, whether in mines, plantations, or administrative roles, was a deliberate, calculated strategy. A man's wage was intentionally made insufficient to support his family.
Making it impossible for just one person to provide.
Right, compelling his wife, children, relatives, etc., to join the colonial service in order to make ends meet. This was a calculated move to maximize the labor force available for colonial plantations and industries, as colonial administrators realized that if men were well paid, their families would likely remain working on their own farms or in local trading, which yielded more autonomy and reduced the available labor pool for colonial needs.
So suppressing wages was crucial to the system.
It was a core functional element of the exploitative system, effectively leveraging the African family unit to provide more labor.
What's truly fascinating here, and a crucial nuance to our understanding, is that while the overarching narrative of colonial authoritarianism is quite strong, especially at the national level, recent research challenges some conventional wisdom about local institutions under colonial rule. We often hear about decentralized despotism, where colonial powers simply empowered despotic chiefs. But is that always the full picture, or was the system sometimes more complex at the local level?
That's a crucial point for a deeper, more accurate understanding. The conventional narrative often posits that post-colonial authoritarianism in Africa stems either directly from colonial decentralized despotism, essentially empowering despotic chiefs by eliminating traditional checks and balances, or from enduring pre-colonial authoritarian structures.
It's the standard story, yeah.
But a newer, more granular perspective, supported by detailed historical research, argues that while colonial institutions were indeed authoritarian, unaccountable, and repressive at the national level, designed for extraction and control, this was not generally true of local institutions. This distinction is vital for understanding the full functional complexity.
So British indirect rule, often depicted as a uniform system that propped up strong chiefs, actually had far more complexity on the ground, often constrained by practical realities.
Yes, exactly. British administrators faced significant constraints in the financial resources and, crucially, a scarcity of human capital, what was often referred to as the thin white line of officials.
Not enough people to run everything directly.
Simply not enough people. They simply didn't have enough personnel to directly administer every village and every community. This made relying on existing African elites expedient. The idea that they would arbitrarily invent tradition or simply grant despotic powers to chiefs was rarely an effective solution because it often caused significant discontent and outright resistance.
Which they couldn't afford to manage.
Precisely. Such resistance was costly to manage given their limited resources, so pragmatic adaptations were often necessary. The system had to function with limited direct oversight.
That makes perfect sense. It's like they had to work with what was already there to some extent, adapting to local conditions rather than imposing a completely new, uniform structure. And the data from British Africa seems to back up this surprising heterogeneity at the local level.
Absolutely. Researchers compiled extensive data from 463 local government units across British Africa around 1950, and the findings reveal striking diversity in how these native authorities, NAs, were structured. Only 17% of native authorities consisted solely of a chief ruling alone.
Only 17%. That's low.
Very low compared to the stereotype. In stark contrast, 48% were council-only NAs, where decisions were made by a group without a single dominant chief, and 35% included both a chief and a council, suggesting a balance of power.
Wow, so almost half were council only.
Exactly. This remarkable variety strongly suggests that broad generalizations about indirect rule provide almost no insight into the form of political institutions at the local level. The functional reality was far more varied and complex than often portrayed, pushing back against the simplistic, despotic chief narrative.
And this complexity seems to be intrinsically linked to the persistence of pre-colonial constraints on power. So despotic rule wasn't the norm even before colonialism in many parts of Africa, and those checks on power often continued to function.
That's precisely what the evidence suggests. Our sources indicate that despotic polities were rare in pre-colonial Africa. Many societies had strong egalitarian norms and a desire to maintain the internal autonomy of the local community, as noted by Vancina.
So local control was important.
Very. Rulers were often constrained by influential councils or lacked state-like institutions entirely, as seen with the Tiv and Igbo of Nigeria, who had more decentralized segmentary political systems. While exceptions existed, such as the powerful emirates of the Sokoto Caliphate with their unconstrained rulers, they were indeed exceptions rather than the rule across the continent.
Right.
So the colonial period didn't necessarily create despotism at the local level from scratch. It often perpetuated or modified existing structures, for better or worse.
And we see this continuity in how these institutions carry over into the colonial period, suggesting that the colonial imprint wasn't always a complete overwrite.
Precisely. Researchers observe a high degree of persistence in historical state institutions. Consider the evidence. Almost all native treasuries, the administrative and financial units of the native authorities, corresponded to existing pre-colonial state names.
They kept the names.
They kept the names. Furthermore, traditional ruling dynasties survived until independence in every case, with only temporary depositions, such as in Asante or Benin. There was also a high degree of overlap between pre-colonial state areas and native treasury administrative units. This remarkable continuity suggests a functional persistence in many local political structures, even under colonial administration.
So the colonial system, in many instances, adapted to, rather than entirely abolished, existing forms of governance to achieve its goals.
That seems to be the case, yes. It often had to.
And the composition of these councils within the native authorities also reflects this persistence, right? It wasn't just colonial appointees filling these roles.
Correct. The data is compelling. Council members often had independent bases of power, stemming from their traditional authority or community standing. The vast majority of councils were dominated by hereditary elite title holders, 56%, or popularly selected members, 30%.
So real local power players.
Exactly. In contrast, members appointed by the native authority chief, 12%, or directly by British administrators, a mere 3%, were quite rare, and even when appointed, their roles were often only advisory. This directly challenges the idea that chiefs were simply unchecked and unrestrained despots, created or unilaterally empowered by colonial rule, at least at the local level where many traditional checks persisted.
It points to a much more complex system where colonial administrators had to navigate and often incorporate existing power dynamics.
Precisely. They couldn't just impose their will everywhere.
What's truly fascinating here is that these councils weren't just for show or symbols of tradition. There's concrete evidence that their presence had an actual measurable impact on how resources were managed at the local level, showing they had a real functional role.
Yes, that's a key insight. A clear outcome of council presence is that native authorities that included councils spent a lower fraction of their budget on salaries for officials.
Okay, that's tangible. Fewer salaries means what?
Right.
More money for other things, less graft.
It suggests that these councils served as a genuine check on executive discretion, directly influencing how funds were allocated and potentially limiting opportunities for self-enrichment by individual chiefs or administrators. For example, in the Gold Coast Mampong district, it was the finance boards and area committees, which were part of the council system, that drew up preparatory budget drafts.
So the council had budget oversight.
Exactly. These drafts were then discussed and approved by the larger divisional or subdivisional council. This indicates a tangible, functional constraint on executive power at the local level, preventing unchecked spending and potential abuses.
Let's look at some specific case studies to really bring this nuanced local governance to life. How did this play out in places like northern Nigeria or Asante?
Well, in northern Nigeria, specifically in the powerful Sokoto Caliphate, despite its pre-colonial history of more authoritarian rule, British rule largely perpetuated the pre-colonial status quo of strong rulers and weak councils.
So, more authoritarian there, reflecting the past.
Somewhat, yes. However, even here, the emirs lost significant autocratic privileges, such as their independent control over armies and their power over large-scale slave raids. So while powerful, their unchecked power was still curtailed by the new colonial oversight and the imposition of a different order. The system changed them, even as it maintained their prominence.
And Asante in the Gold Coast, a pre-colonial state with well-established internal checks on power, seemed to maintain those constraints even under British rule, rather than becoming more despotic.
Yes, in Asante, effective political constraints emerged prior to and persisted throughout British rule. The traditional practice of destoulement, the ceremonial dethroning of a chief by his own people for misrule or disrespect, remained a powerful, functional check.
So the people could still remove their teeth.
Exactly. Even under British indirect rule, chiefs understood they could face community-led removal if they overstepped their bounds or failed to represent their people. This clear indication that traditional elite-dominated councils continued to hold significant power over the monarch's actions demonstrates a surprising continuity rather than a radical transformation towards despotism. The system adapted, but didn't completely erase these internal checks.
What about Buganda in Uganda, which also had a powerful pre-colonial ruler, the Kabaka? How did the British approach local governance there?
In Buganda, although ruled by a historically powerful Kabaka, the British, while recognizing his authority, also conferred significant power on local councils. What's even more intriguing is that over time, there was a deliberate trend towards more popularly selected council members.
Like, what?
Well, the sources say it was mainly to reduce the despotic powers of the Kabaka. This suggests an active effort within the colonial framework to introduce some level of accountability and broad representation, even if it was ultimately to serve British administrative goals by balancing the power of traditional rulers. The functional outcome was a system that, in some ways, constrained pre-existing absolutist tendencies.
So in areas that lacked large centralized states before colonialism, like parts of Kenya and Tanganyika, how did local governance evolve under British rule? It sounds like they had to create structures.
In these areas, colonial rule created artificial territorial divisions where large pre-existing states simply didn't exist. But the institutional form that emerged wasn't individual despotic chiefs. Instead, it was scaled-up councils.
Scaled up counts.
Yes. This is another direct challenge to the broad despotic chief narrative, showing how practical constraints on British administration, their limited personnel and resources, often led to the formation of different local structures, emphasizing collective decision-making, even if colonial power ultimately sat above them. The system had to create functional units of local administration, and councils were often the most pragmatic and stable option.
And this next point is absolutely crucial because it highlights where the colonial model did intentionally create or exacerbate authoritarianism. What happened in white settled colonies like South Africa and southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, this seems to be a very different functional outcome.
This is indeed a critical distinction, and it speaks directly to the deliberate function of the colonial system in those contexts. In these white settler colonies, such as South Africa and southern Rhodesia, direct European governance did initially disrupt local institutions and systematically weaken pre-colonial rulers. However, the shift towards empowering what became truly despotic local officials often occurred later, and for very specific strategic reasons.
Okay, so not from the outset.
Not always, and not in the same way. This empowerment happened particularly after hardline white settler regimes gained power. For example, post-1948 in South Africa with the onset of apartheid, and post-1962 in Zimbabwe where minority white rule was entrenched. This was done specifically to counter rising African nationalist sentiments and to impose extreme control over the indigenous population.
So it was a tool of political control against nationalism.
Precisely. This function of colonial power was explicitly designed to consolidate white minority rule and create a highly extractive, segregated system, making it a very different mechanism of control than the more varied indirect rule seen elsewhere. Here, despotism was a manufactured tool of suppression.
And finally, Sierra Leone, a mixed case in its pre-colonial structures. How did it fit into this nuanced picture of local governance under the British?
Sierra Leone's pre-colonial states lacked strong executive constraints and formalized councils at the aggregated state level, but lower-level countries did have mechanisms to check big men-women and ensure local accountability. British rule strategically weakened the larger ruling states and instead recognized these lower-level country chiefs as powerful paramount chiefs, effectively leading to institutional persistence at that more localized level.
Okay, so strengthening the local chiefs.
Yes, but while some changes lessened authoritarian powers, such as reduced territory or the loss of independent armies, the institutionalization of indirect rule could also, paradoxically, weaken the traditional democratic basis by giving chiefs direct colonial backing and removing their ultimate accountability to their own people.
Ah, so they answered to the British, not their communities.
Essentially, yes. This added a layer of colonial influence that, while maintaining existing forms, subtly but profoundly altered their functional accountability, setting the stage for future problems.
So, we've explored the motivations driving colonialism and the intricate mechanisms of colonial control, including those surprising nuances in local governance. Now, let's turn to the system's outcomes, the tangible manifestations of underdevelopment that persist today. This isn't just history. It's directly linked to the present realities of many African nations.
Absolutely. One of the most enduring economic distortions, a direct legacy of the colonial system's functional design, is Africa's continued role in the world market. Even today, it's primarily defined by the production of primary goods and agricultural products.
Still exporting raw materials, importing finished goods.
Largely, yes. This is not by chance. While advanced European countries controlled the production of manufactured goods and high-value commodities, colonialism systematically ensured Africa remained a dedicated supplier of cheap raw materials. This locked African economies into a particular, subordinate, and highly vulnerable role in global trade, inhibiting their ability to industrialize or diversify. The system's purpose was to create this dependency.
So the colonial system essentially designed Africa to be a perpetual resource supplier for Europe, not a self-sufficient, diversified economy. And that intentional design led to major internal issues, like chronic food shortages, a direct functional outcome of the system.
Precisely. African populations were compelled to concentrate in the production of goods meant for export, cash crops like cocoa, coffee, groundnuts, rubber, rather than those needed by local populations for subsistence and food security.
Growing stuff for Europe, not for themselves.
That's the essence of it. This deliberate disarticulation of goods production led directly to food shortage and escalation in food prices across many parts of the continent. The present-day situation where Africans now import their food is, as our sources starkly state, a carryover from colonialism. The system actively discouraged local food security and diversified economies in favor of export-oriented production, creating a dependency that persists.
And this wasn't just about what was produced, but how African economies were integrated into the global system. Premature integration sounds like it set them up for systemic failure from the start.
It absolutely did. African trade and economy were integrated prematurely into the world market and international trade. This means that local economies, without adequately developed internal dynamics and forces of production, lacking robust domestic industries, strong internal markets, diverse economic bases, were essentially hijacked by the more advanced ones from Europe.
Swallowed up before they were ready.
In a way, yes, the consequence. They became perpetual debtors to these more powerful economies and were rendered highly vulnerable, unable to absorb international market shocks. This vulnerability continues to this day, a profound functional design flaw inherent in the colonial economic system. It was less about integrating them as equal partners and more about subordinating them as suppliers.
And this deliberate lack of internal industrial development directly relates to the absence of what economists call accelerator and multiplier effects. Can you explain what those are and why their absence was so damaging to Africa's long-term development?
Sure. The accelerator effect refers to how selling goods for profit and then reinvesting that money within the economy boosts further economic activity, leading to a cycle of growth. This was totally absent in African territories during the period of colonialism.
Why?
Because raw materials extracted from Africa were exported directly to Europe, not processed or used by local industries within Africa. This meant there was no internal reinvestment, no development of local manufacturing, and thus continuous import dependence for manufactured goods. The system bypassed internal development.
So no internal reinvestment cycle for the raw materials they produced, and the multiplier effect was also systematically suppressed.
Exactly. The multiplier effect is about the reinvestment of accumulated profit to stimulate and generate new profit within an economy, leading to wider economic benefits. Colonialists did not reinvest profits appropriated from the African economy back into Africa's productive capacity. Rather, they transferred the profits abroad for the development of their home economy.
Took the money and ran, basically.
Essentially, yes. This systematic siphoning of wealth, preventing any internal self-sustaining growth, greatly accounted for the present underdevelopment of most African economies. The functional design was to extract, not to build internal capacity.
So the entire economic system was designed to extract, not to build. And this extractive logic also permeated the development of physical infrastructure and social structures. We're talking about roads and railways that didn't connect people within Africa, but rather connected raw materials to ports.
Precisely. Transport networks, particularly rails and seaports, were not to link different towns and rural areas for purpose of effective communication and development within the continent. Instead, their primary function was to evacuate easily the raw materials from their sources, from mines, plantations, or agricultural hubs in the interior, to be effectively exported abroad.
Lines running from the interior straight to the coast.
That's the typical pattern. This resulted in a distorted, disjointed, and disarticulated transport system, where infrastructure radiated outwards rather than creating internal economic integration. This led directly to an absence of economic integration and cooperation among the African territories, a fundamental flaw in development that persists in many regions today, hindering intra-African trade and development.
And even the limited social amenities they provided had a disarticulating effect, leading to the problems of rapid, unplanned urbanization we see in many African cities, which were designed as colonial, administrative, and extractive centers.
Exactly. Most of the little social amenities provided, schools, hospitals, basic infrastructure, were concentrated at a place, specifically colonial urban centers. These centers were designed as administrative hubs and collection points for resources. This concentration led to massive rural-urban migration.
People flooding into these few centers.
Yes, causing overcrowding, the development of filthy and slump environments, poor hygienic conditions, and the spread of epidemic disease in these burgeoning cities. Managing these pervasive problems has remained a single most important problem confronting African states today. The system created centers of extraction, attracting labor, but not fostering broad, equitable human development across the landscape.
And finally, colonialism fundamentally altered African social structures, leading to the emergence of new classes and, inevitably, new forms of internal class struggle, setting the stage for post-independence challenges.
It aided a clear emergence and development of classes in Africa, a system that didn't exist in the same way pre-colonially. This included the comprador bourgeoisie, local elites who actively collaborated with colonialists serving as intermediaries, along with the petty bourgeoisie, the proletariat, wage laborers, and the vast majority of peasants.
Creating new divisions within society.
Definitely. The African petty bourgeoisie, in particular, served as a conveyor belt through which the colonialists exploited and siphoned the economy of African countries. This created internal divisions and a system of exploitation that, tragically, often continued even after formal independence, as these new classes inherited elements of the colonial state's extractive machinery. The system established enduring social hierarchies.
It's a lot to take in, the sheer scale of this systematic approach designed to extract and control. But as we move towards understanding the enduring legacy, there's a powerful argument to be made that colonialism had a uniformly negative effect on Africa's development trajectory. It directly challenges any optimistic views that might suggest otherwise.
Indeed. While some argue that Europeans brought benefits like technology, improved institutions, and eventually ended slavery, our sources emphasize that it is difficult to make a strong case in favor of colonialism actually fostering development that otherwise would not have taken place.
Right. The benefits are often overstated or questionable.
And the crucial point here, a foundational insight, is the counterfactual. We must rigorously consider what might have happened without colonialism, and, even more importantly, the legacy of colonialism on post-independence outcomes. The system created specific paths that limited future development.
When we look at the data on economic outcomes, it paints a stark picture of stagnation or even decline for many. GDP per capita, for instance, tells a sobering story.
While GDP generally saw modest increases during the colonial period, these increases often disguised deep inequalities and a lack of true, broad-based development. Crucially, many African countries were poorer in 2008 than they were at independence.
Poorer decades later, that's incredible.
It's quite stark. Think about that. Half a century or more after gaining sovereignty, they were economically worse off. Examples include Burundi, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. Ghana, a promising post-independence state, only returned to its 1957 independence level around 2005.
Decades of lost progress.
Essentially, yes. Botswana is cited as a notable exception, demonstrating that development was possible despite colonialism, not because of it, largely due to unique resource management and pre-existing institutional strengths. The system set a low ceiling for growth and left a heavy burden.
And for African living standards, particularly in the white settled colonies, it was a severe deterioration, not an improvement, marking a profoundly negative functional outcome.
Absolutely. In white settler colonies like South Africa, Kenya, and Zimbabwe, Africans experienced a severe deterioration in living standards. Our sources show real wages falling by as much as 50% after 1914-16 due to systematic land expropriation and the deliberate creation of dual economies, one for white settlers, another for dispossessed Africans.
A two-tiered system by design.
Explicitly. This led to a huge increase in inequality, with Kenya's inequality potentially rising by a staggering 40% between 1914 and 1950. The system was meticulously designed to benefit the white settlers at the direct expense and immiseration of the indigenous population. This wasn't incidental, it was the intended function of the settler colonial state.
What about human development indicators like literacy, education, and life expectancy? We sometimes hear the argument that these improved under colonial rule.
Well, while these generally did improve from very low bases during colonialism and after, the pace was often agonizingly slow. And importantly, these improvements were often attributable to broader international trends in public health and education, or specifically to the efforts of missionaries, rather than direct, widespread colonial development efforts.
So not necessarily a result of colonial policy.
Not necessarily driven by colonial policy as a development goal, the source highlights a powerful counterexample. Even during the murderous dictatorships of Idi Amin in Uganda or Jean Bedel Bokassa in the Central African Republic, human development indicators continued to improve, albeit slowly.
Wow.
This suggests that global trends and external factors were often more influential in these gains than the immediate regime's actions, whether colonial or post-colonial. This challenges the idea that colonial rule was the primary or even a necessary driver of such gains. The system simply wasn't geared towards broad human flourishing.
So the benefits are often ambiguous when you look closely at the data and consider the alternatives. And institutionally, we also see a consistently negative legacy, particularly concerning political freedoms and private property rights, which are foundational for development.
Indeed. On political freedoms, the data shows that political rights fall almost monotonically in some colonies, such as Namibia under German rule and Tanzania after British takeover, especially after initial resistance was crushed. Generally, there's a clear pattern of deteriorating political rights under colonial rule before brief increases at independence, which were often followed by subsequent declines under one-party states.
A familiar pattern, unfortunately.
Yes. For private property rights, the massive expropriation of land from Africans in settler colonies directly coincided with a significant deterioration in the security of property rights for the vast mass of the population. Overall, there's no general positive effect of colonialism on the extent of private property rights. This is crucial. The system fundamentally undermined indigenous rights and replaced them with systems designed for external control and extraction.
So the overall trajectory was negative, even if some mechanisms at the very local level were more complex. Now, to truly understand this, we need to distinguish between different types of colonies, because the paths of underdevelopment weren't uniform, even if the overall effect was similar. Let's look at colonies that had centralized, well-established states before colonialism.
Right. For colonies with pre-existing centralized states, such as Botswana, Ghana, and Rwanda, colonialism ironically blocked further political development that might have occurred organically. It made local elites less accountable to their citizens by shifting their allegiance to the colonial power rather than their own people.
Breaking that link between rulers and ruled?
Precisely. This often resulted in far more predatory rulers post-independence. This was a profound missed opportunity for indigenous development. Africans in these polities, like the Tswana states or the powerful Asante Kingdom, were already adopting technology, developing sophisticated trade networks, and showing extraordinary ability to negotiate with external forces before the scramble. Colonial rule essentially held in check institutional reforms or development paths that might have otherwise occurred. The system froze or distorted indigenous political evolution.
And tragically, colonialism actively contributed to creating or hardening destructive identities in some of these places, with devastating long-term functional consequences.
Yes. Colonial powers created cleavages where none existed or hardened pre-existing distinctions and identities for administrative convenience or for divide and rule tactics. The most tragic and direct example is the Hutu and Tutsi distinctions and the introduction of identity cards in Rwanda, which explicitly marked ethnic affiliation.
The Belgian role there.
Exactly. This systematic classification intensified pre-existing, often fluid social distinctions, hardening them into rigid ethnic divisions and directly contributing to the horrific genocide that occurred decades later. This was a deliberate functional outcome of colonial administrative policies designed for control, not cohesion.
What about Ghana, specifically? How did its pre-colonial centralized state experience colonialism's negative trajectory, despite its initial promise?
In Ghana, economic growth during the colonial period, particularly in cocoa production, was largely despite the British colonial state, not because of it. The export dynamism in cocoa, for instance, was wholly African development, driven by local farmers and entrepreneurs.
So Africans drove the growth themselves.
To a large extent, yes. British built railways and roads, while physically present, were positioned not to develop the country but to rule it and facilitate extraction, connecting resource points to ports, not fostering internal markets. Furthermore, land allocation became less efficient due to the imposition of indirect rule and the creation of systems that undermined traditional communal land tenure. So, even in a case with seemingly strong pre-colonial foundations and agricultural potential, the colonial system primarily served its own administrative and extractive ends, rather than fostering genuine broad-based development for the African population.
Yeah, there are the white settler colonies, like Zimbabwe and South Africa. Their experience sounds like the most extreme form of extraction and a deliberate blueprint for inequality.
It was. The colonial rule in these areas was highly extractive and led to quite serious immiserization of Africans. This meant a deliberate reduction in their living standards and economic opportunities. It also resulted in massive increases in inequality, creating a stark racial hierarchy where white settlers accumulated vast wealth and power at the direct expense of the indigenous population.
And this legacy carried over powerfully after independence.
Critically, yes. Post-independence leaders, such as Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, often inherited and, tragically, continued to operate within the framework of this extractive colonial state. They often did so with even fewer constraints on their power than the colonial administrators themselves, leading to perverse post-independence dynamics directly rooted in the legacy of racial discrimination, land inequality, and the established systems of extraction. The colonial system provided a deeply damaging blueprint for continued authoritarianism and economic injustice.
And finally, what about the rest? Those mixed cases that might not have had large centralized states or significant white settlement, like Sierra Leone or Uganda. How did the system of underdevelopment manifest there?
In these cases, the benefits of British presence, such as some stability or infrastructure, were often ambiguous, temporary, or strategically placed purely for colonial control. These gains were often reversed or became dysfunctional after the British departed. Take Sierra Leone. Railways were built, but their route was notoriously changed after the Hut Tax Rebellion in 1898 with a view of controlling Mendeland, illustrating infrastructure as a tool of repression, not development.
Building it to control people, not help them.
Essentially, schools, like the prestigious Bose School, focused on educating the sons of paramount chiefs and elites, not broad-based development for the entire population, creating a limited, collaborating class.
And that carries into the present day, with very clear functional links to modern conflict.
Indeed. The devastating post-independence civil war in Sierra Leone, starting in 1991, was partly motivated by deep-seated animosity against the local despotism of chiefs and political exclusion. This resentment was directly linked to how the British had systematically shaped and governed the colony, empowering certain chiefs and disconnecting them from popular accountability.
So the roots run deep, right back to the colonial structure.
Absolutely. This demonstrates how even in these mixed cases, the mechanisms and functional design of colonial rule left a deep and damaging legacy that continues to manifest in modern challenges and conflicts. The initial function of the colonial system profoundly shaped the long-term, often negative trajectory of these nations.
As we bring this deep dive to a close, it's abundantly clear that the story of European colonialism in Africa is fundamentally one of profound systematic underdevelopment. We've traced the economic drivers in Europe, the intricate and often brutal coercive strategies implemented on the ground, the complex realities of local governance that, while nuanced, ultimately functioned within a broader system undermining self-determination, and the devastating long-term impacts on African economies, societies, and institutions.
What truly stands out for me is how the functional design of colonialism, from land confiscation and forced labor to monetary manipulation and infrastructure built purely for extraction, created a system that actively prevented internal, self-sustaining development.
It was built not to develop Africa.
Precisely. Even where local institutions showed a surprising degree of persistence, the overarching national-level authoritarianism and the relentless siphoning of wealth ensured that Africa remained economically dependent and structurally vulnerable. The system was, you could say, a deliberate counter-development machine.
For us, the preponderance of evidence suggests that while the processes were complex and varied across the continent, the overall impact of colonialism was overwhelmingly negative, setting Africa on a trajectory of continued challenges long after the colonial powers formally departed.
Yeah, the weight of the evidence is pretty clear on that.
This deep dive should prompt you, our listeners, to think critically about historical power dynamics and how systematically, systems designed for extraction can create enduring echoes in the world we inhabit today. shaping destinies for generations.